Gary, Indiana is not the kind of place that needs much introduction for people who know anything about American industrial decline. It became famous for what it built, and then famous again for what it lost. And the gap between those two states of fame is one of the more complete stories of 20th century American economic and social history. This is the rise and fall of America's most abandoned city. What went wrong in Gary, Indiana? The beginning? A company builds a city. Most cities develop organically over decades or centuries. A settlement forms around a water source or a trade route, then a post office, then a courthouse, then a commercial district, and eventually something that functions as a city. Gary was not built this way. Gary was constructed on purpose from a specific plan by a single corporation in a very short time for the express purpose of making steel. It is, in this sense, the most comprehensively corporate city in American history. The decision was made in 1905 by Albert Henry Gary, the chairman of U.S. Steel, which was itself, at the time, the largest corporation in the world, capitalized at $1.4 billion and assembled by J.P. Morgan from Andrew Carnegie's Carnegie Steel and numerous other companies in 1901. The corporation needed a new integrated steel plant, and it needed land on or near the Great Lakes for raw material transport and shipping access. The Indiana Lakeshore offered exactly that. Flat, sandy terrain on the southern shore of Lake Michigan, directly adjacent to Chicago's existing rail network, accessible to iron ore arriving from the upper Great Lakes on ore boats, and to coal from southern Illinois and the Appalachian coal fields. U.S. Steel purchased approximately 9,000 acres of Indiana dune land for $7.2 million in 1905 and began construction essentially immediately. The Gary Works, as the integrated plant was named after the company's chairman, was the largest integrated steel plant ever built at the time of its construction, a facility that processed raw materials into finished steel products on a scale and with a degree of vertical integration that had not previously been attempted. Coke ovens, blast furnaces, open hearth furnaces, rolling mills, and finishing operations were all built on the same continuous site. The plant began producing steel in 1908. Simultaneously, U.S. Steel built a city to house and sustain the workers the plant required. Streets were platted on a grid. Water and sewer infrastructure was installed. Housing was constructed in multiple price ranges. Company-built housing for workers at different wage levels and land platted for private home building. Schools were planned and built. A business district was laid out along Broadway Avenue, which was designed as the commercial spine of the new city, with the expectation that private commercial investment would follow as the population grew. Workers arrived in waves from across the United States and from Europe. Polish, Hungarian, Czech, Italian, Romanian, Greek, and Mexican workers, along with African Americans migrating northward from the Deep South, all arriving in a city that had been sand dunes and marshland 2 or 3 years before they got there. Gary was incorporated as a city in 1906, with Albert Gary himself attending the formal ceremonies. By 1910, the population had already reached approximately 16,800, a functioning American city built in under 5 years on land that had been functionally uninhabited at the start of the decade. The pace of construction and population growth was extraordinary by any historical standard, and the visible results, a steel-producing city with schools, churches, a commercial district, and a diverse population, were the physical proof that American industrial capital could build a community from a corporate decision as efficiently as it built a factory. The peak, Gary at full production. By 1960, Gary had a population of approximately 178,320 people, the city's census peak, and the Gary Works was operating at a scale that made it one of the most productive steel facilities in the world. U.S. Steel's Gary Plant Complex at its largest covered approximately 4 miles of Lake Michigan shoreline. The specific employment figure at peak production, approximately 30,000 workers at the Gary Works in the late 1960s, requires some context to fully appreciate 30,000 people working in a single industrial facility, all receiving union wages and benefits, all spending money in a single mid-sized American city. The economic multiplier effect of that payroll on the surrounding community was enormous. The steel produced at Gary went into automobile bodies, appliances, construction steel for buildings and bridges, and the full range of mid-20th century American manufacturing. The Gary Works was not a peripheral operation in the American economy. It was one of the facilities that produced the physical material of post-World War II prosperity. The city that surrounded the plant had developed into a genuine urban community with a full range of institutions, amenities, and cultural life. The downtown on Broadway Avenue was commercially active through the 1950s. Sears, J.C. Penney, Goldblatt's, and independent retailers occupied a commercial district that served both the local Gary population and the surrounding Lake County region. Movie theaters, restaurants, hotels, and professional services concentrated in a downtown that was, by the standards of a city of that size, genuinely active. The Marquette Park District along the lakefront provided public green space and beach access. The school system enrolled tens of thousands of students. The city's cultural life was vigorous enough to produce artists, musicians, and public figures who would eventually be traced back to Gary's specific ecosystem. Steelwork at the Gary Works was organized by the United Steelworkers of America, and the wages available to steelworkers in the post-World War II period were sufficient to sustain working-class homeownership and a standard of living that the generation before the union contracts had not been able to achieve. The contracts negotiated through the 1940s and 1950s, made possible by the leverage of organized labor in an industry with high capital investment and limited ability to substitute for skilled labor, provided health benefits, pension rights, and wages that compared favorably to any employment option available to workers without college degrees. Gary's racial demographics were changing through the 1950s and 1960s in ways that would become more significant than the city or its institutions fully understood at the time. African American workers had been recruited to Gary from the city's earliest years. The Great Migration from the South, which brought black workers to steel cities across the industrial Midwest in multiple waves through the early and middle 20th century, was a significant force in Gary's population composition. By 1960, African Americans constituted approximately 39% of Gary's population. The steel plant's workforce was not integrated on equal terms. Black steelworkers were systematically assigned to the most physically dangerous, hottest, and lowest paid positions within the mill, but the wages available in steel were still significantly better than what was available in the South, and the black neighborhoods of Gary's West Side developed vibrant commercial and cultural communities during this period. The cracks, begin, competition, and civil rights. The steel industry's relationship with import competition began changing in the 1960s in ways that American steel executives recognized, discussed, and largely failed to address adequately. Japanese steel producers, rebuilding from the destruction of World War II with modern basic oxygen furnace technology and integrated port facilities designed for maximum efficiency, were producing steel at lower cost per ton than American plants, whose infrastructure reflected investment decisions made in the 1920s and 1930s. European producers, particularly in West Germany, were in a similar position. The older the American plant, the less efficient it was relative to a newly built international competitor. American steel companies, including U.S. Steel, faced a structural choice in the 1960s and into the 1970s. Commit to substantial capital investment in modernizing American plants to improve their cost competitiveness, or continue extracting profits from existing infrastructure while it remained viable without the investment modernization required. The industry as a whole leaned toward the latter. Dividend payments to shareholders were maintained. Capital investment in modernization lagged. The union contracts that had made steel jobs good jobs also made labor costs in American plants higher than in countries with lower wages or weaker labor protections. The combination of underinvestment, labor cost differentials, and increasingly efficient foreign competition created a gap that became harder to close with each passing year. Meanwhile, the civil rights period was producing political changes in Gary that were nationally significant. Richard Hatcher, a black attorney and city councilman, was elected mayor of Gary in November 1967, taking office in January 1968. He was, alongside Carl Stokes in Cleveland, one of the first African-American mayors of a major American city. The Hatcher campaign and election attracted national attention as a demonstration of black political power in a northern industrial city with a large black population. Hatcher served 5 terms as mayor, from 1968 through 1988. Hatcher's mayoralty was accomplished under extraordinarily difficult conditions. The city government he inherited was underfunded, the county government was hostile, and the federal resources that might have helped address Gary's emerging structural problems were limited and contested. Hatcher sought and received federal community development block grant funding and participated in the Great Society programs of the Johnson administration. But the scale of Gary's emerging economic challenges was beyond what any combination of municipal policy and federal grants could address. The pattern of white residents and businesses leaving Gary for the suburbs during the 1960s and 1970s was real, significant, and not attributable entirely or even primarily to Hatcher's election. The suburbanization of American cities was occurring throughout the metropolitan Midwest, regardless of the racial composition of city governments, driven by federal mortgage policies, highway construction, and the economics of suburban homebuilding. In Gary specifically, the combination of racial transition, the declining perception of the city's economic trajectory, and the availability of suburban Lake County communities as alternatives produced a white exit that was faster and more complete than in some comparable cities. The tax base erosion that resulted from this departure was immediate and compounding. As middle-income homeowners and commercial businesses relocated to Merrillville, Valparaiso, and other Lake County communities, the property tax revenue available to Gary declined, reducing the quality of city services, which in turn reduced Gary's attractiveness to the residents who remained mobile, which accelerated further departure. The feedback loop that began in the 1960s has not stopped. The collapse, steel industry crisis. The crisis came in earnest in the 1970s and 1980s. U.S. Steel began significant layoffs at the Gary Works in the late 1970s as steel demand declined and import competition intensified. The 1980 to 1982 recession hit the steel industry with particular severity. Demand for steel collapsed as the automobile industry contracted and construction activity slowed in the recession. U.S. Steel permanently closed multiple blast furnaces at the Gary Works during this period and did not reopen them. The numbers are stark. Employment at the Gary Works peaked at approximately 30,000 workers in the late 1960s. By the mid-1980s, employment had fallen to approximately 6,000. By the early 2000s, the plant employed approximately 3,000 workers. Each layoff cycle represented not just the direct employment loss, but the secondary economic activity, the restaurants, stores, service businesses, and professional services that the steel workers' wages had supported. The multiplier effect of steel employment worked in reverse during contraction. Each direct job lost removed approximately 3 to 4 additional jobs from the local economy through reduced spending. The Gary Works did not close. It has operated continuously in some form, and U.S. Steel still maintains production at the Gary facility, which was renamed the Gary Works after U.S. Steel reorganized. But the plant that employs 3,000 workers in the 21st century is not the same economic engine as the plant that employed 30,000. The difference between those two numbers is inscribed in Gary's abandoned buildings, its population decline, and the specific quality of its streets. The population decline tracked the employment collapse. From the 1960 peak of approximately 178,000, Gary's population declined to approximately 151,000 in 1970, 137,000 in 1980, 117,000 in 1990, 102,000 in 2000, 80,000 in 2010, and approximately 69,000 in 2020. Each census represents another increment of departure, people making the rational calculation that there was no reason to stay in a city where the economic foundation had been removed. What was left behind? The physical city that 178,000 people required in 1960 still largely stands in 2024. That is the specific quality of Gary that makes it photographically dramatic and economically devastating simultaneously. The buildings did not disappear with the people who used them. They remained vacant, unmaintained, and slowly dissolving in Indiana's humid continental climate as a precise three-dimensional record of what was built and what was lost. The City Methodist Church on Washington Street is the most photographed and most recognized symbol of Gary's abandonment. It was dedicated in 1926, designed by the architectural firm Patton & Miller in Gothic Revival style, with a sanctuary seating 1,500 people, a full gymnasium, classrooms, and facilities that reflected the ambition and prosperity of a congregation that expected to be permanent. The congregation departed in 1975 as the surrounding neighborhood changed and the economics of maintaining a structure of that scale became impossible. Since then, the exterior stone walls have stood largely intact. Gothic stonework is durable, while the interior has been open to weather, structural failure, and vegetation for nearly 5 decades. Trees now grow from the upper choir loft. The sanctuary roof has failed in sections. The space inside is open to the sky in ways that Gothic churches are not designed to accommodate. The Union Station on 4th Avenue, a Beaux-Arts railroad station from 1910, designed to serve as a civic gateway to a significant American city, has been without rail service since 1970 and without any consistent use since. The building has been the subject of preservation discussions at various points without producing a funded restoration plan. It decays on a measured timeline. The former Sheraton Hotel on Broadway served the city's commercial needs through multiple ownership and name changes before closing in the 1980s. The Indiana Hotel, the Palace Theater, and dozens of other structures represent the same pattern, built for a city of 175,000, maintained for a declining period, and then abandoned as the population and the tax base that would have funded their upkeep departed together. The Broadway commercial corridor that served as Gary's retail spine in the 1950s is now a series of vacant storefronts, check-cashing businesses, and the occasional surviving institution, a pharmacy, a community organization, a church, serving the 69,000 residents who remain. The contrast between the scale of the commercial buildings and the volume of commercial activity they currently sustain is the most visible single indicator of the difference between what Gary was and what Gary is. The Marquette Park facility on the lakefront, the Memorial Auditorium, and the City Hall building represent a different category of abandonment, institutional infrastructure built for civic ambitions that the city's fiscal situation cannot currently support. The lakefront position that made Gary's industrial site so valuable, the southern shore of Lake Michigan, is potentially the city's most significant economic asset for any post-industrial future. The question of how to realize that value while the fiscal condition of the city remains constrained is one that Gary's leadership has been working on without a definitive answer for decades. Demolition of the unsafe and blighted structures has occurred incrementally using state, federal, and local funds, but the number of structures requiring action consistently exceeds the available resources. As of the early 2020s, Gary had reduced its inventory of abandoned and blighted structures significantly from its peak, but thousands of abandoned properties remained. The pace of structural failure in unmaintained buildings, particularly in a climate with freeze-thaw cycling, means that the inventory of critical demolition targets grows continuously, creating a process where available resources are chasing a moving target. The human cost and the cultural legacy. The population that remained in Gary through the decades of contraction did not choose to stay out of ignorance of the situation. Many had no practical alternative. Home ownership in a city with declining property values does not produce the equity needed to relocate and purchase elsewhere. And the people with the most mobility, younger, more educated, more skilled workers, were precisely the ones who left earliest and most completely. What remained was a population that was either too committed to leave, too economically constrained to relocate, or both. The poverty concentration that resulted from this pattern is severe. The median household income in Gary is significantly below the Indiana and national averages. The poverty rate has consistently exceeded 30% in recent census counts. The school system serves a population that has the full complement of challenges associated with concentrated poverty. The city government has operated under fiscal stress for decades, with structural deficits that have required state intervention and that have reduced the quality of services available to residents. The crime statistics reflect these conditions. Gary has had, in various years, some of the highest per capita violent crime rates in the United States. This is presented not as a judgment of the residents, but as a description of what concentrated poverty and the systematic removal of economic opportunity produces in any community where these conditions persist over decades. Against this context, the cultural legacy of Gary is both genuine and poignant. The Jacksons, Joe Jackson and Catherine Jackson, raised their 9 children in the 2-story house at 2300 Jackson Street on Gary's west side. Joseph Jackson worked in the steel industry and played guitar in a local band. The children, Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, Marlon, Michael, and their siblings, grew up in a 2-bedroom house and became, through a combination of talent, family drive, and the specific cultural ecosystem of Gary's black music community, the Jackson 5. Michael Jackson was born on August 29, 1958, at Gary's Methodist Hospital. He grew up at 2300 Jackson Street and left Gary as the Jackson 5 began their professional career. The family moved to a larger home in California in 1969, when the Jackson 5 were signed to Motown. The Gary House has been a site of pilgrimage since Michael Jackson's death on June 25, 2009. It is maintained by relatives of the family and visited by fans from around the world. What Gary is now. Gary today is a city of approximately 69,000 people, about 38% of its 1960 population, operating the physical infrastructure, partially, of a city 3 times that size. The Gary Works still operates as a reduced-scale steel production facility. The lakefront area has received some investment. The Marquette Park area has been maintained, and discussions about lakefront development have been ongoing for years without producing major transformation. The University of Illinois Chicago has operated a Gary campus. The former Indiana University Northwest became part of Purdue University Northwest. The existence of a university campus in Gary provides some economic floor and some institutional continuity that purely post-industrial cities often lack. The casino, the Majestic Star Casino, which operated from 1996 through 2020, and its successor, Caesars Southern Indiana, provided tax revenue during its operational period. The genesis of Gary's situation contains nothing unique to Gary specifically. The pattern of company-built industrial city dependent on a single large employer, followed by that employer's contraction, is a template that applied to dozens of American cities in the steel, coal, textile, and auto industries throughout the 20th century. What makes Gary distinctive is the scale of the original city, and therefore the scale of the decline and the density of the abandoned built environment that the departure left behind. There is no single decision that went wrong. U.S. Steel's underinvestment in plant modernization was rational by shareholder metrics and catastrophic by community metrics. The suburban migration was rational for the individuals who participated in it and devastating for the city they left. The steel industry's import vulnerability was the product of international economic dynamics that no single party controlled. The result of all of these overlapping rational decisions and external forces is a city that built more than it could sustain when the underlying economy changed. As Gary Mayor Jerome Prince, who was elected in 2019, described the situation, every generation of Gary's leadership has had to deal with the consequences of decisions they didn't make. The challenge now is whether we can build something new without pretending that what happened here didn't happen. That is a different kind of challenge than building a city on sand dunes in 1906. But it is not easier. The question nobody has fully answered, the question that Gary poses to American urban policy and has been posing without a satisfactory answer since the 1970s, is not primarily about Gary. It is about the broader category of post-industrial cities that face structural conditions similar to Gary's, where the economic premise that generated the city's existence has been partially or substantially removed, and where no established framework for recovery exists. Pittsburgh is cited most frequently as the successful model of post-industrial reinvention. The Pittsburgh of the 1980s was a city in severe distress. Steel employment collapsed, population declined, the downtown was in trouble. The Pittsburgh of 2024 is a functioning metropolitan region with a diversified economy anchored by medical research. UPMC has become one of the largest employers in Pennsylvania. Technology, robotics, and the institutional activity of Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh. The reinvention took 30 to 40 years and required a combination of anchor institutions, geographic assets, and the specific human capital that a city with Carnegie Mellon's research output could attract. Gary has none of those structural advantages in equivalent measure. Purdue University Northwest exists in Hammond, adjacent to Gary, and provides some institutional presence in the region, but it is not the economic engine in northern Indiana that Carnegie Mellon is in Pittsburgh. Gary has no equivalent of the UPMC medical system. The city's proximity to Chicago is both an opportunity. It places Gary residents within commuting distance of one of the largest and most diverse metropolitan economies in the United States, and a liability because businesses and residents who can access Chicago's economy have the option of locating in Chicago's other suburbs rather than in Gary specifically. The federal government has made available various tools for post-industrial city redevelopment over the decades. Since Gary's decline became undeniable, community development block grants, HUD grants, EPA, brownfields funding, Opportunity Zone tax incentives created by the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Gary has pursued these resources consistently and has used them to fund demolition, limited infrastructure investment, and specific project development. The resources available through these programs are meaningful at the project level, but insufficient at the scale of the structural challenge. No federal program has been designed to replace 27,000 lost manufacturing jobs in a mid-sized city with something equivalent. The Marquette Plan, first proposed in the 1990s and revised in subsequent years, envisions transforming Gary's lakefront from industrial and underused brownfield land into a mixed-use development zone, connecting Gary to the recreational and commercial amenities of the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore, which was designated a national park in 2019. The Indiana Dunes National Park designation, which elevated the dunes from national lakeshore status, brought more visitor attention to the southern Lake Michigan shoreline and potentially created a platform for Gary's lakefront to become commercially relevant in ways it has not been since the industrial era. Whether this potential is realized depends on private investment following the public infrastructure investment that the lakefront plan requires. The honest accounting of where Gary stands in the early 2020s is this: the city has stabilized its population, declined to some degree. The fiscal condition of the city government is severely constrained but not in acute crisis. The Gary Works continues to operate at reduced scale, and specific neighborhoods and properties are being developed by a combination of public funding and private investment that is occurring more slowly than Gary's supporters would like and faster than Gary's critics acknowledge. As Gary Mayor Jerome Prince, who took office in 2019, described the situation, every generation of Gary's leadership has had to deal with the consequences of decisions they didn't make. The challenge now is whether we can build something new without pretending that what happened here didn't happen. That framing is honest about what Gary is and what the task requires. Not restoration to 1960, but construction of something viable for 2030 and beyond, using the assets that remain: the lakefront, the rail connections to Chicago, the institutional presence, and the resilient community that chose to stay, without pretending that the scale of what was lost can be fully replaced by any combination of available policy tools. The story of Gary is not unique, but it is complete. Every element of the post-industrial American city narrative is present in concentrated form, from the company-built origin, to the peak prosperity, to the racial politics, to the industrial collapse, to the physical abandonment, and the stubborn persistence of a reduced community. Understanding Gary is understanding something fundamental about how American cities were built and how fragile that construction was when the economic premise changed. This is the rise and fall of America's most abandoned city. What went wrong in Gary, Indiana? The city is still there. So is the question. Hit that like button and subscribe. More content like this coming.